and welcome to the Sovereign Submission Substack interview here. And today I am very happy to have Jason MacKenzie on here. We're going to be talking about navigating grief. So, Jason, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here. Again, my name is Jason MacKenzie. I'm a husband, father. I live in London, Ontario, Canada. For anyone from the US, that's 2 hours from Detroit. So, thankfully, in the most southern part of Canada. Um, and I write on Substack at Man Down, and I write about grief and a lot of the lessons I've learned through navigating grief. And so, lost my first wife, Cindy, to suicide, and then I lost. That was in 2010, just about 16 years ago. Just the anniversary was a few days ago, and then my our daughter, Chloe, was 19, and she died in a car accident about 3 years ago. And her death was really not. It's complicated, but it wasn't obviously totally related to her mother's suicide, but it was very intertwined, I would say, with her mom's suicide. So, yeah, so I'm here trying to help myself and help other people along the way.
Hmm. There's something that really landed with me. I think just sharing all that. First of all, I appreciate your bravery because there is a certain kind of bravery in being willing to share grief, especially in Western culture where it's kind of like, be happy, be joyful, pretend like nothing's wrong. And I mean, I certainly see this in men's work as well, where a lot of the times the focus is on trying to help men get in touch with their grief. And it sounds like you've been doing a lot of this work for yourself. And then you're also helping other men navigate this as well.
Yeah, well, it's. I think what's interesting in my story is I can relate to exactly what you just said. When my wife took her own life, I basically drank myself silly for almost 5 years after her death because I think pretty typically thought grief was just something weak people did, and I had two kids to raise. I saw myself as a strong person and I had a life to get on with rebuilding. And I can remember driving off the like off the property of the cemetery after Cindy's funeral, thinking that exact thing. Okay, that chapter's over. It's time to move on. And, but I drank I drank really every day for the next four and a half, roughly 4.5 years. And it never crossed my mind a single time that those two things were related to each other, which actually sounds crazy to like as I reflect back on it, but I think it's pretty common, because I've done a lot of work with men, not just about grief, but dealing with mental health issues and the an addiction, and the pattern is always some version of the same thing. There's some unresolved, painful thing that happened, at some point in the past, often in the distant past. And it's very hard for guys to understand that this thing or these things that happened all that time ago are related to the painful, intolerable things I'm dealing with now. It's really hard to make that connection and see that it's like really a through line that connects the past and the present. And so for me, when I finally stopped drinking, it was, just kind of sort of a rock bottom moment. I disappointed my daughter and made a total ass out of myself, which I had done many times before. But I don't know. There's something about this particular moment that was, I don't know. I just had a moment of clarity, and it was in that space that sobriety created that I started grieving Cindy's death, and it happened 5 years after she died. And I didn't know what was happening to me. I thought I was going crazy, to be honest with you. It was my current wife who said, "Yeah, dude, you're grieving." And I remember thinking, God, that sounds like it could be true. And um, I just think that, in that, I remember thinking to myself, like, when you're struggling, even though logically you probably like logically we know we all struggle with things and there's lots of people who are in really tough spots. But I think when we struggling, it's also the loneliest place in the world. And and so, as I grieved and I started to actually see how that process was actually helping me come to terms with the things that happened in the past, it really made me want to share that because I knew there's got to be countless other people that are dealing with the same thing. To your point, it was very scary, just, to put myself out there, but yeah, it gets easier. So
Well, it definitely gets easier, and I think it's. I mean, I can say that from my own experience with the work that I do, but and I think it is really important. I mean, I've had my own stints of grief. I think at a certain point we start to accrue these moments in our lives for various reasons, whether it's the death of a parent or a loved one or a child, or like it's a divorce or something else along those lines. At some point we ended up hitting a point of grief, and it's what we do with it. And to your point, I had my own experiences around this, and just like you said, like I numbed out in my own way. For me, it was a rebound relationship with somebody where I ended up basically, yeah, drinking a lot for a while, and eventually came to my senses when I saw like this isn't really working. This is actually just putting me into a really bad place and into another relationship. And it was when I got out of that relationship that the grief around my divorce fully hit me. And I had to spend some time necessarily sitting with it and working with it. And one of the best choices I made was it was like, all right, I'm not getting into another relationship. I'm going to figure myself out because I don't know myself. And this is part of this. It's so evident to me that there's part of this here because if I knew myself, I wouldn't be going and doing this.
yeah, I think it's a great insight, and it takes. I think some people never get there to figuring that out, and I think a lot of times, it takes a shockingly long time to realize that what we're doing is not serving us, and the courage to do something different. So, um, yeah, no, kudos to you for being able to see that and try something new. It's a hard pattern to break out of.
Well, and so when you're working with other men, what's some of the ways that you work with them to help them start to see that pattern and recognize it so that they can break out of it? Or do you find that they've come to you when they've kind of hit that point of realization and they're like, "Oh, yeah, I've hit bottom here." Because this is what I found with men's work in general is that men typically seem to need to hit bottom before they can actually go and do the work they need to do.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess it depends on the context of the work I do. So I run a business where we coach. So I've been working with dads, especially for about 10 years, and the business that we run is a mastermind program for dads who own businesses. We teach them skills on how to be better husbands, fathers, and business owners. And so that's one context. But I think that when it comes to grief, I think that so much of what we do. So, first of all, I don't work with men in the immediate aftermath of
Okay.
grief. It's too intense, man. And
Yeah.
it's just what I'm really fascinated about. And I do a lot of executive coaching and leadership development, and I'm really fascinated, just generally speaking, at like sort of a meta level with what makes change possible and like lasting change possible, but also what makes it so hard. And I think that so much of what makes change so even like so say somebody's, for example, suffered a devastating loss and it's a year, 2 years, 5 years later, and they can't move forward. They just feel like stuck. They're in these patterns they know they should break out of. We have this self-protective mechanism that keeps it is beautifully designed to protect us from emotional risk, but also keep us stuck. So let's say for example you have a guy who's ready to move re-engage in his life and his relationships while carrying the loss forward. Okay, so the question is, okay, so what are you doing that's actually working against that right now? And what you find out is, so you might say, well, you know uh, I shut down whenever somebody asks me about the person I lost. But really, okay, that's it. So that's interesting. So what do you think causes you to do that? And underneath it, there's a self-protection system that is protecting you from risk. So, it's really about, well, imagine yourself like just being open about how you're feeling. Like, what's like the worst thing you could imagine happening there? And you're like, well, I imagine myself opening up and then just completely falling apart and, scaring the shit out of my kids if they see me and then like them being worried about their dad. Okay, well, what would you actually have to believe to justify that worry? And so we start to unpack like these core assumptions that form the basis of this operating system. And a belief might be, I believe that I assume that if my kids, if my kids see me like out, like not in control of my emotions, it will cause them harm, like more harm than they've already experienced. Say they lost their mom or something. Okay, well, if that's what you believe and it justifies the worry, then your self-protective behavior about not opening up in front of your kids, like it makes perfect sense. It's designed to protect you from a risk that's you might not even be like a worry that you might not even be aware you actually have. And so then the question becomes, okay, how do we look at these assumptions that are really driving, like they form the basis of the way you're interacting with the world, and how do we like just start to disprove some of these things, and so very safely and in small incremental steps we design little real world tests, and so that's a really long-winded answer, but the point is that fundamentally what keeps us stuck, whether it's in grief or anything else, is usually like a self-protection mechanism system that we don't even aware, like we're not even aware is operating in our lives, and so exposing it and then helping unwinding it is really powerful for people.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the thing that I find is that a lot of times there are unconscious patterns at work. Well, and with any area of life where there's a potential, whether it's around grief or other behaviors, there's usually an unconscious power dynamic at work
Mhm.
where it's kind of like, all right, here's this unconscious operating system. It's going to go through and do things. I mean, as much as I think people like to convince themselves that they're consciously aware and making choices from a place of like every choice I make, I know what I'm doing. I found that a lot of the time that's simply not the case.
I totally agree with you. And it's really the difference. So I like the paradigm I like to think about it is like the difference between sort of subject and object. So, you know, you're right in the sense I totally agree with you. I see this constantly is we are all subject to these assumptions, that we hold about ourselves and about the world that are guiding our behavior. Like some of them we're aware of, many of them we are not. And so when we're not aware of them, so we are subject to them. They basically they got us by the throat, or they got us by the back of the neck, and they're leading us around. When you shine a light on them and you can help somebody see them and examine them, you take them from being like something you're a subject to, and you create space between them, and you turn them into an object where you can actually like look at them and say, "Oh, like this is like a really powerful assumption I hold, and is it true? Where did it come from? Am I the same person like maybe this assumption served me in some way when I was a kid? Like, am I that same person as I was when I developed this assumption?" So what happens is you take it from something you're subject to, so something that's got a hold of you, and you turn it into an object that you can examine and reframe and reintegrate into your life so you have a hold of it. So I agree with you, like, and we all have this. I'm sure you have it, I have it in areas of my life I'm not even aware of right now you know
Oh yeah, no, I mean I'm actually sitting with a realization I had this morning. So
right, right.
that was actually why I was a little late on the thing because it kind of had this moment of clarity this morning, and it's just like and I was like I have an interview, I have to get going here, but I'm like all right. So I mean I think it's one of those cases where it's like you when we can suddenly get that kind of distance and it's like oh suddenly I see myself in a different light and I understand why and
Mm.
what's been going on here and what the operating principle is. Well, now I get
Yeah,
the chance to change that. And whether I change it or not, of course, is up to me because that's where the conscious awareness and presence comes into play. Oh, like now I know. Okay, so what am I going to do now about it?
that's right. And I think one of the traps that grieving, especially grieving men, get into is this. I like it's a like a loyalty trap. So, when the person they love dies, they basically plant a flag in the ground at that moment and they stand guard at it. It's like, so, as long as I'm not like my my loyalty to the person I lost, because they might feel responsible in some way. I mean, especially if a parent, I think it's such a common thing for anybody that loses someone to feel responsible, at least somewhat responsible, have some level of guilt. "Oh, I should have said this. I could have done this differently." Like as we reflect back at the million interactions we have with the people in our lives. I mean, there's infinite opportunity. Like there's infinite ways we could have handled things differently, right? So we plant a flag there and we say, my still being in pain is a representation of the loyalty I have to this person. If I move forward in my life, that's a betrayal of that person. And so I am going to, almost like the tomb of the unknown soldier, I'm going to stand guard here. And it does not a single thing to bring them back, obviously. And it does everything to stop you moving forward, because moving forward doesn't mean you're not experiencing pain. Like, come on, man. Like, if you lost someone, you lost a kid, look, I'll be a grieving dad for the rest of my life. Right? But it's not the only thing I'll be. Like, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a writer. Like, I, you know, I try to be a kind person. Like, I have all these different interests, these ways I interact with the world, and I'm a grieving father. But I don't have to be only a grieving father to be loyal, or grieving husband and grieving father to be loyal to the people I lost. I think the way I choose to do that is by creating meaning and trying to do the best I can to honor their lives and their memories by being useful to other people. But it's like just this past weekend. I mean, it was a really difficult weekend for me. I was exhausted. I was just deep in grief, like basically Saturday and Sunday. And these things happen, and I feel better today, and that's great. So the waves of grief always pass. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, we don't do, we can, especially guys, can really have a misguided sense of loyalty that keeps them stuck, in a past that they can't move forward from.
What so I mean, I think we kind of spoken to it, but what do you think is at the root of that loyalty? Is it a fear of moving on? Is it kind of a thing of like, if I do this, I betray her, and on some level, or him, or whoever, but on some level, this person's going to know, even though they've passed on, but they're going to know, or this is going to haunt me in some way.
Yeah, I think it's all those things. So I'll give you an example from my own life of things, something that I've thought that thankfully I noticed in the time, and at the time, and tried to make a really intentional choice not to allow myself to go there. Was, I remember one time just sitting over to my right here on the couch and clutching my daughter's. I mean, this was maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, maybe. I'm clutching her urn to my chest, just bawling my head off, man, just uncontrollably sobbing. And I remember thinking, hope that if she's looking down on me, that she can see this so she knows how much I love her. And I'm
Mm.
like, and I remember thinking afterwards, I remember like, dude, that's crazy, man. You know what I mean? Like that's that's man, that is the door. It's funny that I think, like, as we navigate our lives, the door to victimhood is always wide open. It's always, but when you have, like, suffer like a really devastating loss, or like a really, impactful trauma. I mean, it's almost like, what is it, like Homer in the Odyssey with the sirens or whatever that are calling him, those, like calling the ships to the shore where they all die on the rocks or whatever. Like the door to victimhood is wide open, and when you've suffered a really difficult experience, it's pretty tempting, man, and very easy to just walk through it without even realizing it. So, that moment afterwards, I was sitting there, I'm like, you get it. That's not the way. That's not the way to stay connected to Chloe, man. You know?
I think, yeah, I hear you on that. I think something else that also kind of stands out with me, and it was something kind of from your story earlier, like when you were driving away from your wife's funeral. It's like there's this idea that grief, that at some point there's a stopping point on grief, but it's like the other day, and I've been divorced now for almost 5 years. I was meditating and I had this moment where I ended up like coming out of it, and I'm like, I was like saying, to my ex-wife, she's obviously not there, but I'm like, I'm so sorry.
Mm.
I'm so sorry for the things that I did.
Mhm.
And there was that moment of grief. And I don't know if I'll always end up grieving that divorce. It's a bit different than, you know, the death of somebody. But I do know that at least for as long as it needs to happen, there will be those moments. And I think just normalizing that it is okay to have those moments, those experiences of grief around whatever it is that you're grieving is really important. That it's not a one and done type of situation.
I totally agree. And I think at the same time, yeah, and so yes, and whatever that looks like is completely unique to whoever's experiencing it, and there's no right or wrong a length of time or whatever. Um and at the same time, I think it's perfectly normal, like another something else to normalize is that it absolutely sucks, man. Like so, there's times where, let's say, like just even on this weekend, I'm like, I can allow myself to sit with it and, you know, like just allow the wave of grief to wash over me. But it's like there's nothing enjoyable about it. And there's like, and part of I think part of it is, it will pass, but it'll happen again too. And you don't know when, right? So it's I think it's also okay just to realize that like you can get very, very, very tired of it and frustrated and like, why do I have to keep experiencing this? And I hate this and blah, blah, blah. Then that's okay. The main thing is that you don't, uh, you know, cope, like you turn to coping mechanisms to help you avoid it. Because as painful as it can be, and I'll be honest, man, like my daughter's death is much more. I mean, my wife's death was painful. My daughter's death is much more. Just for me personally, it's just much more. It's been horrific, but but at the same time, it will not kill me, man. Like it's as intolerable as it can feel. It won't kill me. However, I know that the things that I need to do to avoid it, those probably will. I've tried that approach. It doesn't work. So yeah.
There's a certain reality where in being able to face what we're dealing with, we also face ourselves. And so in
That's right.
facing ourselves, we move forward. I mean, that's the bravery. That was the thing that the realization I came to a few years ago, where I'm like, I have to move forward. And I made whatever choices were made. And it's kind of interesting too, because my dad passed in a while back as well, like
Mm.
in 2019. So I mean, I've had moments of grief around that, but also I kind of came to the realization, like, whatever I wanted to do in regards to him, the best way I could do it was to move forward. And that didn't mean that I didn't carry the grief or that I didn't carry my memories of him, but that I could change my relationship with myself as a result of what that grief showed me.
Mm,
It
yeah.
became a sacred mirror.
What do you think it was that allowed you to get to so after your divorce and you kind of had this moment, or maybe it was a series of moments where you realized I got to move forward, or maybe even with your dad, like, do you have a sense of what it was about that particular moment that led to that realization?
Well, when I got out of my divorce, I kind of had a real one of the things I promised myself is I wasn't going to make the mistakes that I'd made in that divorce again.
Mm.
And so I was already on this road of trying to change who I was. But I got into this rebound relationship like a couple months after because I wasn't comfortable with the pain I was sitting with. But that relationship was very volatile.
Mm.
And after I broke up with that person, for I think the second or third time, I was laying there in my bed, and the realization I had is like, I don't know myself as a man. I don't know what it means to be a man. And the model that I had for my masculinity was my dad, and that wasn't a healthy thing either. And I came away with the realization that basically the rebound relationship, I was basically dating my dad.
Mm.
And this is actually something that I found in that I found and really kind of looked at with in general is like I think that to a certain point, this goes back to the unconscious behavior patterning. We end up dating our parents until we work through whatever it is, the wounds that we have around those parental figures, and that can take a while. So being in a fully conscious relationship with somebody doesn't really start to happen until it's like, oh, I've separated out the the parental wounds and the wounds around the feminine and the masculine. So that was the start of my journey around that. And I ended up taking like buying a course on breakups because it was like, I don't know how to handle breakups and divorces. I need some help here. But I'm glad I did, because that's what led me to men's work. And it was just kind of this continuing series. And what I ultimately came away with that was really important was realizing I'm not alone, that there are a lot of other men out there who are hurting and don't know how to relate to this stuff. And I'm not, and I mean, in all honesty, I think like with grief and stuff, let's just say people in general, but for me in particular, it was honing in on, here's these specific experiences that I'm having. I'm not unique. Okay. Well, now what can I do to move forward on that? Because I want to change my relationship with these patterns, and I can't do that by doing the same old thing.
Yeah, man, that's amazing. I think it's great that you got to that point. I'm curious, when you had that realization, like, okay, I don't know what it means to be a man. Did that like was that? I mean, I'm sure it was a combination of everything, but was it like, did that feel liberating? Did that feel like terrifying? Like, oh my God, what do I do now? Like, what was that like?
It's terrifying. I had, for a long time, hated myself for being a man, because that
Mm,
was something I learned from my stepmom. I didn't realize that until, again, until I did all this work. But it was a very interesting realization that helped me to see, like, oh, this is something I don't care for about myself. I need to change my relationship with it. And that meant changing my relationship with my dad, but my dad was already dead.
mm,
So I didn't even it wasn't like I could go and talk to him and say, like, these are the things. So I had to do that work without him. And yet it was an invitation. It's like, it's time to step out of the shadow of this person who isn't even here anymore. And I think that that's kind of one of the opportunities of grief, because I ended up really getting the chance to do a lot of grieving. I mean, I would say from like 2017 on until about 2024 is what I would call my period of wintering.
mm.
And if I don't know if you're familiar with the term wintering, but it's there was this really good book about it that this woman wrote, just called Wintering, and she talks about like this experience of grief. And I ended up actually writing a book called Inner Alchemy of Wintering, where I explored some of just like kind of the spiritual processes around this, because it's like this experience of where there's a season for grief, there's a season for these things. And it was the grief itself that gave me the fire ultimately to change my life. Because in sitting in that grief, I was finally able to grieve all the things about my childhood and my earlier experiences and my relationships that I had been basically pushing down and avoiding. So it wasn't even just a case of realizing, like, oh, I don't know how to be a man in this world. It was, I don't know how to handle the burdens that I've been carrying, and I need to figure out a new way. And the grief was part of the process of doing that.
It's powerful. Yeah, I think that's super profound, man. Good for you. Because I mean, this kind of stuff destroys people, and I don't give myself I don't really give myself any credit for the fact that it didn't destroy me. Like I think of so many times where, you know, I think we're all on the so much closer to the razor's edge than we like to believe. And a couple decisions I've made many horrible decisions in my life, and if some of them had turned out differently, I could find myself in a very different situation. And even with the like stopping drinking, like sometimes people. So it's been about 12 years, and people will say, I mean, people, especially people who are maybe still struggling with it, will say, "Oh, like, oh, how did you do that? You're so strong." And I'm like, "No, that's not it. I just, for whatever reason, I had this like, because I tried to quit 50 million times before the last time and failed every time. And and I just had this moment of clarity. And I've never wanted to drink since. Why? I don't know. So it hasn't even required strength. It's just I feel just so fortunate that that was the case, and that I haven't been well, like white knuckling it every, for 12 years. But yeah, I find like those moments of epiphanies or insights, like that are like life-changing insights. I just find those moments and how people experience them and like sort of what leads up to them just super fascinating.
Well, it is. And I mean, I think that you hit on something really important there, which is like we are all just a decision away from
Ugh.
possibly having our worst day or whatever else. And it's how we resource ourselves. Like that was the thing that kind of stood out to me is that when I had this realization, I was living in a town where I didn't really know anybody. I was working a day job and I was driving at night doing door dashing. So I was just working all the time, and that wasn't really much of a life. And
Mm.
it's when I started to reach out and develop community connections and things like that that it changed. And the interesting thing now is that I can kind of look and say like, yeah, I could have something happen, but now I have people I can turn and talk with, and connect with, and that makes the biggest difference. Like there's this very really interesting terminal point where it's kind of like, okay, we can either let our habits destroy us or we can let our habits build us, and we could also necessarily need to turn toward other people.
Oh, I totally agree, man. You know, because I think when I was going through, after my wife's suicide, I mean, I, I my main thing was making it look like I had my shit together. Like, so, really hiding, like nobody knew how much I was drinking. Not even my wife knew how much I was drinking, like I was just living basically a lie, trying desperately to make it look like I had a handle on things because after, it wasn't just my wife's death. Like it was the 5 years leading up to it that were just a nightmare. Like she was a cop and she ended up in homeless shelters and like locked psych wards and electroshock therapy and rehab. And like, so it was a nightmare. I started drinking during that time, trying to raise two little girls. And, you know, even though I felt like I was falling apart, it really mattered. It didn't even matter that it was true. But just more that people thought it, where people would say, "Oh, Jay, you're so strong, man. I don't know how you're getting through this." And then after she died, it was the same thing. Like, "Oh, look at you. You've built this new life. You're remarried. You got great kids, and after all that you've been through, yeah. Well, you know what? I mean, I was going out and drinking at lunch and drinking on the way home and drinking at night, and like all this stuff. So, and I think that so I didn't have anyone to turn to because I wouldn't turn to anyone. Like I mean, and with my daughter's death, I mean, my wife's death, like ultimately after I stopped drinking, like it set my life down a very different trajectory. Like we would never be talking right now if that had not happened. And so there was like a lot of beautiful gifts that came from that tragedy. And one of those things was getting involved in doing work and meeting an incredible group of guys and going to business with them and having like a band of brothers that I can turn to. But at the same time, and I always tell people this because I think it's just important to something else that's important to normalize is everybody knows at some level that they're supposed to ask for help if they're struggling. Like, how many times have we heard that? You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it's like you have to be kind of dumb not to think it'd probably be a good idea to ask for help. The problem is, and I always tell guys this, it sucks to do it. Like nobody likes to go up to anybody and go, "Yeah, I'm barely hanging on, man. Like I can't figure this out. I need help." Like it's not a pleasant experience for me to do that, but I do it because it's always worthwhile. You know what I mean? But I've not gotten to the point where I particularly enjoy doing that. So I think it's important to let guys know that a lot of times asking for help is just the actual act itself is not.
It's like you froze up there for a moment. I heard the actual act of asking for help is, and then I didn't hear the rest of it.
Yeah, it's not an overly pleasant experience, but
Right.
do it anyway because it's worth the result is worthwhile.
Well, and it gets easier.
Mhm.
The more we exercise that muscle, so to speak, it gets easier. For me, one of the ways that I did this is that I started with something small. Like I would go into a grocery store and I needed to find something, and I'd walk up to a clerk and ask them, like, where's this thing? Because that's something that so many people don't do, and that they're
Mhm.
there working, of course they know where it is, so why spend 15, 20 minutes or longer trying to find something when you can just ask somebody to show you where it is? So it's like, even if that's like the muscle that you need to exercise, like start with something small. But that's a great way to do it, because the fact is, like, if we ask for what we want or we need, the worst that we're going to get is a no. And no's aren't the end of the world. It just means no. It's a fair thing to say, like, but I think that that's so often what stops people from asking for help, is that thing of, like, either like, I've got to have it all together, I've got to white knuckle my way through life, or it's the fear of rejection, or it's a combination thereof.
Yeah. And I love that idea. I've never heard somebody describe it like that, but like practicing, like asking for help in like really low stakes, like a lower stakes situation. I think that's such a good idea. I'm gonna steal that. But yeah, no, but you know what? I think something else that is like related to that is that you just made me think about, but is also very common is especially like, and I'm sure this happens with women too, but I work almost exclusively with men. And one of the things I see all the time is like the Mr. Nice Guy syndrome, right? So a guy who will not express his needs. And so is too busy running around trying, this like happy wife, happy life. Like, give me a break, man. Like, how about effective communication and healthy boundaries? Happy life. But regardless, I mean, and so, what they do is they try to meet everybody else's needs on their own, and they feel all this resentment and blah, blah, blah. I think when you're grieving, like, one of the things that's really important is to be aware of, to learn to be aware of, and to articulate your needs, because sometimes, like, for example, this past weekend, it's a really difficult weekend. And my need was like, what I really needed was just to be left alone. You know what I mean? Look, I was in the basement most of the weekend. I did come up, like, wasn't a total basement dweller, but I mean, but I try to be really clear about my needs, and my wife is absolutely incredible at respecting those, and vice versa. So yeah, I think in a way that is I think a variation or a different way of asking for help. Just saying, this is what I need right now.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, this is part of the nice guy syndrome. So one of the things that I always find is that, if and I apply this to myself as well as anyone else, if you're having a conversation in your head with somebody, that means that you actually need to vocalize that conversation and have it outwardly, because the conversation in your head isn't going to go anywhere.
Yep.
And so, like, as an example, I had a conversation this weekend with my beloved because I was feeling disconnected. We're in a long distance relationship, so that has its own challenges. And I was having it. I found myself. I'm talking aloud to myself, and I'm like, all right. I just said to myself, okay, if you're saying this aloud to yourself, then it's time to say it. Say it to her. She can't do
Mm.
anything about it. If she doesn't hear it, I can't. And I think that, again, it kind of comes right down to, like, we need to recognize, like, okay, like, if there's something going on in here, then there's something that needs to go on out there,
I think so too.
whatever
And
that
and
is.
yeah, and one of the things I always coach people on when it comes to communications is like like when you're thinking about that kind of stuff, like you can make almost anything make sense in your own head. Like it doesn't matter how crazy it is, man. Like It's nuts what you can like you can rationalize in your own head. So, I think it's I always counsel the guys I coach and stuff is like when you're going to address an issue like that, like especially if you've told yourself a story about somebody else's intentions or motivations or position or whatever is acknowledge it when you're communicating it by saying the story I'm telling myself is this, because it reminds you that you're telling yourself a story because our minds don't like incomplete pictures. So what we're going to do is we're going to make whenever there's a gap in our knowledge, we're going to make up a story to fill in the gap. And because human beings tend to have a negativity bias, the story we make up is often the worst possible version of what it could be. So if you start like a conversation by saying, "Hey, the story I'm telling myself is blah," it reminds you you're telling yourself a story, but it also reminds the other person that you're only actually just sharing your experience. You're not like accusing them, like saying, you're doing this. You know what I mean? And it's a way of expressing your experience, taking ownership over your experience and communicate in a way that's very likely uh, to mitigate the chance of the other person becoming defensive.
Hmm. Yeah. So I want to wrap up here. First, I'd love to hear from you, like where people can find out more about you and how they can contact you if they want to work with you in regards
Yeah.
to grief work or anything else along those lines.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the best place is to go to mandown.tools, and that will actually just take you right to my Substack. And so there's a lot of writing. I have like a lot of free guides on there for men and leaders related to grief, and just a place to really share a lot of the work I put in the world. And there's a tab on there about working with me, and then I have a TikTok. It's jason.s.mckenzie, and if you look up Jason McKenzie on most of the socials, you can find me there.
Okay, and then the final thing I would ask is if you can share a final word or phrase of wisdom that we can carry with us it forward into the day.
Ooh, yes. What I would say is there are gifts, profound gifts to be found in every tragedy, and sometimes it can feel impossible to look for them. They're there. And part of the healing process is looking for them, finding them, and integrating them into your life after the loss you've experienced.
Hmm, beautiful. Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you making some time, and I look forward to sharing this with folks. I'll go up later today, and I'll make sure that I have a little thing in the show notes for where people can connect with you.
All right, brother. Appreciate it, man.
All right, take care.